Well, welcome to the More to His Story podcast. I'm so glad you all have come along, and many people who are in my audience will be interested in this podcast because we generally, people who attend Wesley Biblical Seminary or listen to this podcast are connected at least tangentially to Methodist, Wesleyan denominations. And all of this starts within a period where there was maybe a lack of understanding, and they're off for a long time, a lack of understanding of John Wesley's ecclesiology. And so we have somebody who has dedicated his scholarly life to that subject, and I'm looking forward to introducing him to you in just a second. But many of you will know this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are developing trusted leaders for faithful churches. And we do that through a host of programs from bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees. We have certificate programs, course of study, alternative educational pathways for denominations like the Global Methodist Church, where we have 490 students studying with us in that GMC track right now, and 634 students altogether this semester. So we're really excited to be able to serve the church and really put ourselves in position to develop leaders who are equipped to serve the church. So you can find out more about us at wbs.edu. Also, I'd love for folks to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymilleriii.com. And if you sign up for my email list, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. There's a 45-minute teaching session with me there and an 8-page PDF that you can use in your own exegetical preparation for your preaching or teaching. So I'd love for you to check that out. And then you'll get kind of regular content from me. I have a few courses available at my website, one on the doctrine of holiness, one on heaven, hell, and everything in between, and then a study of the book of Jude, 6 sessions going through the book of Jude. So I'd love for you to check that out at my website. It's andymillerthird.com. All right, I am glad to welcome to the podcast my guest, Dr. Joseph Wood, who serves as the principal of the Nazarene Theological College in Australia. Now, principal there is like being called president here. So maybe to him, I'm a principal. To me, he's a president. Joseph, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Andy. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you. I got a hold of your dissertation a couple of years ago, but read it more recently, thinking about John Wesley's ecclesiology. And so we're going to get there as we think about what happened in 1784. And I talk about that actually a fair amount on this podcast because we're in a stage within Methodism, particularly in North America, where there are new denominations emerging, and that's causing us to think, what does it mean to be a church, so to speak, in this tradition? And you've helped me quite a bit through your writing on this subject. So I look forward to kind of getting into that. But help us know who you are and maybe even a little bit about your context. And that might even help us understand why you would choose to devote some of your scholarly activity to John Wesley's ecclesiology.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you again for having me on the podcast. It was great meeting you not long ago, and maybe we could chat about that if we have some extra time of how we met. My context. So my name is Joseph. I'm originally from the States. I was born in Texas, raised in Alabama, and matured in Tennessee. That's not like to say it. I'm a lifelong member of the Church of the Nazarene. I'm a pastor's kid. My father's been a pastor for just over 50 years in our denomination. 3rd, 4th generation. You might often hear, if you know any Nazarenes, they often like to say that they have been dyed in the wool, part of this denomination. So I was born into the church. I don't have this crisis experience kind of, I've been to the altar plenty of times, but I often say it like this. I've never not known the love of Jesus, which I'm blessed to be in that kind of a situation. I've been nurtured well by my parents, by local churches, and those have been in Texas, Alabama, and Tennessee. Now, when I was considering going to university, of course, as a good Nazarene, you look for your Nazarene institution. And we have several of those around the world. One of those that are closest to where I lived was Trevecca, Nazarene University in Nashville, Tennessee. So I decided to go there. And when I went there, I for some reason, actually, I loved math. I loved mathematics, and I thought I would become a math teacher. But I could not honestly tell you why. When I got to registration, I chose religion. Maybe it was because I was pastor's kid. Maybe it was because I was doing some youth leadership, teaching, things like that. But I signed up for religion classes, and that was my first experience into this world of theology. Semester 1 was good. Semester 2, I took a class called Biblical Exegesis at 7:30 in the morning.
There you go.
And actually, I hated it. Just being honest
Okay.
with you, I hated it. It was the teacher was not the most dynamic. The focus was 19th century higher criticism German theology.
Okay. Wow.
I really struggled with that. And I thought, if this is what theology is, then I don't think this is for me. At the same time, I was taking some general education in history,
Okay. Interesting.
and I just fell in love with it. Prior to university, I didn't like to read. I was a logical, rational, there needs to be an answer, not subjective kind of a person. Hated poetry and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then I fell in love with history, and that marked a transition in my life. I switched degrees, moved to history, political science, thinking maybe I could become a lawyer or something one day, get that logic stuff and then some history stuff as well. But through that journey, I made my way into church history, and I found out that actually theological studies are much broader than biblical exegesis in 19th century Germany. Thank you be to God, right?
Yeah.
So I fell in love with church history, finished my degree, moved into a church history focus in the master's degree at Trevecca, and then got to a point where I was wrestling with God. What's my calling? What's my future?
Yeah.
And I started asking questions of God, questions of the scriptures, questions to mentors. And I highly encourage all of you listening, if you don't have a mentor in your life,
Yeah.
get one. Have someone in your life you can be fully open with, who you can trust, who will pray for you, and who has your back. I highly recommend that. One of those people in my life was a lovely older gentleman in his late 70s who said to me, "You're looking for PhD studies. You're wrestling with this call of God. You think you might be a teacher. Did you know we have a college in Manchester, England, a Nazarene college?" I said, "No, I had no idea." He said, "Well, they're a part of the University of Manchester. So if you went and studied there, then actually you get your qualification from University of Manchester. And it sounds like a pretty good deal." So I investigated and sent them an email. And long story short, in 2006, I moved to the United Kingdom. This small town country boy from Tennessee ends up into moving to another part of the world. I didn't know anyone.
Yeah.
I had visited the UK once, 2 years prior to this, for a short summer study abroad program, thinking that was my adventure.
Right. You're done. Yeah. Back to America.
The 3-week thing. You're probably familiar with the CCCU.
Yeah.
It was one of their programs with Oxford in partnership with Wycliffe College. It was a great experience.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I did. I felt God leading me in that direction. I went, and it changed my life. From 2006, with a couple of times back home in the States, until 2021, the UK became my home. I started studying, fell in love with the people, the place, the culture, the way that academics are done in the British system.
Right.
And I just loved it. So what I didn't say is this wrestling with God thing. Prior to moving to the UK, I was considering it, ministry, future. Is that something for me? And I went to our Nazarene manual, as you should do. I read what ordination is. I read what that it requires, what it means for you. And we have ordained elders and deacons. This might come up in our later conversations, why I'm highlighting it now. We have one ordination, but you're either an elder or you're a deacon. It's not a tiered kind of a system like in other ecclesiologies. It's an equal kind of a system like in the Presbyterian. So I clearly heard God say, "You're not an elder." I understood that to be a pastor, local church. I think you're a deacon. And when I asked some leadership people in our denomination, they had no idea what to say, because the figures at the moment are around 20,000 or so elders and around 800 deacons.
Wow.
In our denomination.
Yeah.
That might be a second podcast if you want to talk about
Yeah. Sure. I am interested in Nazarene Church.
Right.
Yeah. That's I mean, yeah. Global Methodist Church has a tiered system at this stage. Yeah. So
Right.
if somebody has aspirations, and I hate to use that language connected to calling, then generally they're just going to go that elder track because it supposedly opens more doors, right?
So I spent the next several years doing my own research and my own wrestling with God, my own prayers, my own mentoring and conversations. And ultimately, it was research. It was an academic route that led to a confirmation of my calling that
Wow.
I'm a deacon. So I'm an ordained deacon in the Church of the Nazarene. That was in 2018. During the process of study in the UK, I met and married my wife. Her name is Kat, and she's British, and she's an ordained elder. So
Okay.
we're an elder deacon couple.
Yeah.
We've done pastoral ministry together. She's been my boss. Then alongside that, I've been ministering through education. I did my PhD, as we'll talk about in a moment. Started teaching at the college there in Manchester. It became home for me. I ministered in 2-3 churches there with my wife. And then in 2020, a friend of mine through the Nazarene College, a former student there, invited me to consider moving to Australia. He said, we need someone to teach in Wesley's theology and history and the dean of students. This was in May of 2020, so the first major lockdown in the UK during COVID.
Sure.
So maybe it was the COVID fog. I don't know. Maybe it was grass is greener. We just decided, let's put this to prayer. Let's get our mentors involved. And in the end, we believe not that God said, I want you to go there, but that God said, I'll bless you if you go there. Right? Sometimes that happens. I've had many experiences in life where it was very clear. God says, go there. And other experiences, God has says, this is your choice. And if you choose to go there, I'll bless you. And we really do believe it was the right decision for our family at the time. And it's been wonderful. So I've been here for 4.5 years. Started as teacher, but as Andy said, I'm now principal. That was a big change. A couple of years into our time here, the former principal moved to a different university in a different country. And so friends of mine asked me to put my name in the hat, and the trustees chose me. So here we are. I'm principal, but I still get to do research and teach.
Oh, good. Yeah, it's so fascinating, like that part of the story, and just thinking about how you fit into the Church of the Nazarene, how you're calling to part of that, and serving as an educator of clergy, but yet serving as a deacon. That's fascinating. And this really does come into your research. So I'm interested. Let's jump to maybe it's too soon. Like we could probably spend 5 or 6 hours headed up to, but let's jump to 1784, right?
Yeah.
So this is a key year in Methodism, and maybe I should let you say it, but obviously one of the key things that happens is John Wesley ordains, among others, Thomas Coke. Right. And there's a deed of declaration. There is the Sunday service that makes its way to the United States. There's which is the editing of the Book of Common Prayer. So there's this real kind of narrowing, some would say, of John Wesley's ecclesiology, and taking on a more individualistic approach and saying, in a sense, as taking authority. So some people would say, well, this was John Wesley's pragmatic theology at work, his emphasis on soteriology, getting people saved. We just needed to make things happen. But you suggest that what's happening is that actually John Wesley is a sacramental theologian. And I'm just curious, how we get to this place, because it's at that stage where we then begin to see later in the 18th century, and then certainly in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, more denominations come about. And I wonder how much of that would have been different if 1784 would have been different. So I threw a lot your way, and you're smiling at every turn. So maybe I should let you take the conversation where you will, but I'm definitely interested in this sacramental theologian idea.
Absolutely. I'm smiling because, when someone actually reads your work and is interested in it, you don't always get opportunities to talk about it. And in my role as principal, I have a heavy load on the administrative side and less on the teaching side. So this is just fun for me.
I know how it goes.
Okay, I'll do my best to be brief. One thing that if any of you out there are interested in going into higher education and maybe becoming a teacher one day, learn how to be succinct and brief. So I'll do my best.
Okay.
There's a couple of things I wanted to give background, and then we'll look at those 3 things that you pointed out about 1784, and then I'll show where my research led me to this conclusion. The first thing I would say is when I began my studies on John Wesley, I recognized that John Wesley was a Church of England priest. And most of the Methodist histories that I had read began with, around maybe 1688, 89. Wesley was born in 1703. And that kind of just start with John Wesley's life, maybe a bit about his parents. And you hear something about his grandparents and things like that. But actually, I wondered, well, what is the Church of England?
Yeah, sure.
If he's a Church of England priest, if he spends most of his life arguing, I am a man of the church, that's kind of the phrase that he often would use.
Right.
I thought in my, beginning stages, maybe I need to spend some time looking at the Church of England. So my first year of PhD studies, I only read the 200 years of Church of England history prior to John Wesley's birth. That was so formative.
Yeah, sure.
Highly recommend everyone doing Wesley studies. You've got to spend some time in the 16th and 17th centuries. So a couple of highlights from that experience. One was I got a solid grounding in the English Reformation, which was unique. It was different than the German Reformation, different than the Genevan Calvin Reformation, different than the Zurich Swiss Reformation. It was different and very unique. That's the first thing I learned in doing my my reading of 16th century stuff. Then, once you do that kind of journey through that century, you end up with Elizabeth I and something called the Elizabethan settlement. So the Church of England was kind of a little bit of chaos for that century. And by the end of this century, it kind of settles a little bit. Well, the person that's often identified as the one who helped make that settlement happen was a man called Richard Hooker. And Richard Hooker wrote a very large piece of work called Of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. It's an 8-book, an 8-volume resource that kind of lays the groundwork for what Church of England is in nature and in practice. So when I came to that realization, I thought, okay, well, I need to read Richard Hooker. And so for several months, I read every single page of that 8-volume work. We're talking about 2,000 or 3,000 pages of 16th century Elizabethan William Shakespeare type writing, which was difficult.
Yeah.
But when I got to volume 5, which focuses on sacramental theology, and then I get to volume 8, which focuses on ecclesiology and the offices of the church, that was a fundamental realization for me that will come through later on when I get to Wesley. So I'll leave that there for just a moment. Then we move into the 17th century. In the 17th century, again, even though we had this Elizabethan settlement, we then have another roller coaster. We're Protestants, we're Anglican, whatever that means now. But then we have James, of the King James version, bringing Scotland and England together. That's a Presbyterian form of church government coming together with an Episcopalian form of church government. And that just did not really work out. James's son Charles then takes the throne, and then his head is cut off. Then you have the Long Parliament, Oliver Cromwell, Puritan form of church government, which is Calvin influence. And the country ended up not liking that. So we invite Charles II to come back. In 1662, he reestablishes the Church of England with a bit of compromise. This is the Book of Common Prayer, 1662. Was a little bit of a compromise with the Scottish Presbyterians and the English Episcopalians. So the original Book of Common Prayer, 1549, 1552, is a revised version in 1662 to kind of address that tension. Then you move forward a little bit. Charles II's son, James II, then takes the throne, and the fear was that we're going to turn Catholic again. So you can see this 200-year kind of roller coaster ecclesiologically in this context, that there's a fear both for the people, the leadership, and the monarchy of what's going to happen next. Introduced 1688, Parliament invites William and Mary of Holland to come over, William and Mary of Orange, they're known as, to come over. You may have read this in this way, the Glorious Revolution, because there was no fighting. They were invited to come over and take the throne. When they take the throne, the next year, 1689, the Act of Toleration was passed by Parliament.
This is really key. Listen,
this is pivotal.
Almost every movement, what he's about to say, almost every movement that exists today, would be able to have to I'm pointing at 1784, but really we're coming to 1689.
So 1689, you have this almost 200-year fluctuation of ecclesiology. And one of the reasons was the Act of Uniformity, which required anyone performing Christian worship in public in England had to conform to the Book of Common Prayer. What 1689 Act of Toleration does is it allows people to publicly worship in a form not found in the Book of Common Prayer, like legally. Okay. There's many stipulations, though. You can be an independent group, Congregationalist, and you have Baptists now in England. You have some Presbyterian independent groups in England. You have the Roman Catholic Church in England, and this Christian, the Society of Friends, Quakers. And so all of these groups now are allowed, they have legal permission to worship in a way that does not conform to the Book of Common Prayer. That's the reason the Act of Toleration exists, which means you do have a little bit of a calming down, you might say. And this is the first instance in this country, in this context, where diversity of Christian worship is possible without recourse necessarily. It does happen every once in a while, but there's no legal barring of you worshiping in a certain way, as long as you follow the criteria outlined in the Act of Toleration. Okay, that's the first thing. Do you want any questions about that?
That's good. I think it's good. I think so this is where we get to what's called nonconformist. This isn't like a dramatic statement. I'm a nonconformist, but these are people who would take this option that the Edict of Toleration gave. Okay, so great. Now this gets us getting closer to Wesley's time.
Yes. So now we're into the 18th century. John Wesley's born to Church of England parents, and you can read plenty on their story. Raised in as a pastor's kid in a pastor's home, educated at a grammar school in London, then goes to Oxford, is educated there, is ordained alongside his brother. You know about this stuff if you guys are familiar with the Western tradition at all.
Sure that's good. Yeah.
Let's fast forward. The revivals take place. Methodism is growing. Middle of the century, we start building buildings. This is really key. So Methodist preaching houses. And the reason that they're called preaching houses is subtle but important.
Mm-hmm.
John Wesley did not want these buildings to be seen as churches.
Right.
And in his advice to people who are building buildings, he says, call them preaching houses. He even says, here's the architectural plan. You need to make them an octagon shape. And the reason that he did that, he says, is because this is not a church. It's not supposed to look like a church, which would be either a rectangle or like a cruciform kind of a shape. Also, it was good for acoustics, right? So for good Methodists, we're singing Charles Wesley's hymns. And so the acoustics in these octagonal buildings were fantastic. The pulpits are really high. And if you've ever been into one of these buildings, if you haven't, please go and visit England and see some of these. The preacher can see everyone in the room, in the top and in the bottom. They can look you in the eye. And that was intentional. The other reason that Wesley actually says is that so the devil doesn't have a corner to hide in. I find that funny because actually there's 8 corners now to hide in, but they're not 90 degrees. So that was one thing. Methodists began building buildings. When we get to 1784, these 3 things take place. You have the Deed of Declaration, the Sunday service, which is a revision of the Book of Common Prayer, and the ordinations of John Wesley, or I should say more particularly, the setting apart of these 3 people. The Deed of Declaration. The Deed of Declaration was a legal document that John Wesley had registered in the Chancery Court in London in an effort to give some longevity to Methodism after he passes away. And this is really important. And I encourage you got to read this thing.
Yeah.
What it says there is John Wesley knows that he's his time.
He won at this time.
His time is coming.
Yeah.
And Charles has already is been sickly, through his years, and ultimately he dies 3 years later. The other 2 that John Wesley wanted to follow him as leader, John Fletcher, William Grimshaw, both of them had passed away. Right. The other option would have been Thomas Coke, but then Thomas Coke leaves England to go further afield. So John Wesley said, we have to do something, because my fear is if I die and Charles dies, who's going to hold this thing together? And so what the Deed of Declaration did is it had the buildings, Methodist buildings all across the country, to register, basically to sign over ownership from local trustees to John and Charles Wesley, and that named that way. Could you imagine someone coming to you and saying, sign over your property to us. I know you paid for it. You fundraised, you built it, but sign it over to me. And that's what happened. And actually, in the Church of the Nazarene and other Wesleyan traditional denominations, this is the way it works. Your local church is held in trust by local trustees, but technically it's owned by your district, your conference, whatever that is. And I know in Global Methodism, United Methodism, you've had to deal with some of these things.
Right, for sure.
You can thank John Wesley for that.
Yeah, that's absolutely. This comes back to 1784. Yep.
Okay. Problem is, this looks like, because the only way that they could register it was under the Act of Toleration, because it's an independent group of people meeting for Christian worship. That was the only thing that he could do to make it a legal kind of a thing. Now, on the face of it, Methodism registered under the Act of Toleration. The Act of Toleration is designed for those who dissent from the Church of England. Therefore, Methodism dissents from the Church of England. That makes sense. However, if you read it in detail, you find one little thing that kind of changed my life. And that one little thing, or my research, one little thing was John Wesley outlined who could preach in these preaching houses. So Methodist preachers who had probation, like 1 year probation, then there would be a 3-year circuit, and then they could preach in any of these preaching houses. But there's a little clause that says that any priest in the Church of England is allowed to preach in any preaching house anytime they want to, no permission needed. So my question was, okay, if you are a dissenter from the Church of England, like you don't like the Church of England, why would you be welcoming and encouraging preaching from that church of which you dissent from to preach in your preaching house? So that got me kind of thinking, okay, what's going on here? Second thing, the Sunday service. So the Methodists in America, they had been established there from around the 1740s was, I think, the first, 1740s, 1750s. There were some, people going to the colonies to set up Methodist societies. And as you know, Methodist societies are very adaptable. They don't require a building. It's pretty easy to do a church plant, so to speak, of a Methodist society. So they start to grow. By the time you get to 1784, we're talking about, the figure that Francis Asbury, John Wesley said was about 200,000 Methodists. But understanding your history is really important here. 1784. 1776.
Something's happening in the United States around this.
The Declaration of Independence. Okay, so Declaration of Independence. Then the Revolutionary War. 1783 is the Constitution. So by 1784, the United States of America is now no longer colonies. It is a separate country. That's very, very important. This separate country now has some empty churches of England, because the vast majority of priests in the Church of England left during the Revolution because they had to swear allegiance to the monarch. So by definition, they were treasonous. So either you reject your calling, in their case, or you go back to England. And most of them left. What that means for the Methodists, though, Methodists relied upon the church for the sacraments. They relied upon the church for Lord's Supper. They relied upon the church for baptism. But now you have a mass exodus of the church that most of them relied upon. So they don't have access to sacraments.
Right.
So John Wesley in 1784, well, a little bit before this, he writes to the Bishop of London, who was responsible for the churches of England in the colonies in America, and says, could you please ordain some Methodists for me? Because we have this vast number of people desperate for the sacraments. And again, John Wesley was as much an evangelical revivalist as he was a sacramental revivalist. And so his heart...
Okay, let me stop you there, because that is confusing to some. So like people get evangelical revivalist, and that's the kind of image we have of John Wesley preaching on his father's grave. Like I'll become more vile than this, preaching in the fields. Like that's what we want, going for the common people. But to say he's a sacramental revivalist, that doesn't quite probably jive with the way people think about who he is. But this is connected to this whole idea in general that he does not see Methodism, particularly in England, as a separate church. It is still a renewal movement. He never leaves. So again, that sets a context a little bit for what you mean by sacramental revival.
Right. So I'll highlight one or two things that might help you, and I can point to plenty of resources you can put in the notes if you like to. In this context, you have a state church, right? For lack of a better term. In order to be a full member of society, you were required to go to the Lord's Supper to take the sacrament from the Church of England at least 3 times a year. And you had to believe in the Trinity. That's two requirements for you to be able to vote, to buy land, to do business and things like that. Now, I don't know if you know anything about people, but if you give them a minimum, oftentimes they simply do the minimum. So John Wesley is born into an environment where there is a very, very small focus on the importance of the sacraments for the Christian life, partly because it was simply a legal requirement for many people. That's how they saw it. But his formative years, both at home and in Oxford, his reading of the primitive church, his reading of the Acts passage that says they met daily in each other's homes and they broke bread together, and his reading of other extra biblical resources in the next 1 and 2 and 3 centuries after the canon is kind of closed, as it were, he sees the sacrament as fundamental to the lived experience of the Christian life. Not only that, the phrase he liked to use, borrowed from the Book of Common Prayer, is the means of grace. These are the ordinary channels through which God gives his grace to his people. He also calls the Lord's Supper the grand channel of God's grace. In other words, the primary means by which God, through his Spirit, offers his love, his character, his energy, his Spirit to us, empowerment, right? So the other thing to recognize here is, based on this, John Wesley was trying to have the Lord's Supper as often as possible. Right. And Richard Heisenreiter has done really good work on this to say that over the course of his life, on average, John Wesley had the Lord's Supper up to 4 times a week. That's little known as well. And we also have evidence that when John Wesley was invited to lead the Lord's Supper in the Church of England, you have accounts of hundreds and even over 1,000 people coming to the Lord's Supper. This is totally out of ordinary. This is unusual. This is why I say it's a sacramental revival, because the importance of the means of grace in the Christian life is elevated through the ministry of John and Charles Wesley and Methodism. One final thing I'll say about this in terms of resources: John Wesley wrote over 9,000 hymns, or Charles Wesley wrote over 9,000 hymns. As a part of that collection of hymns, 166 were dedicated to the Lord's Supper and printed as a 1-volume book, Hymns on the Lord's Supper. The reason this was done partly is formative. The Wesleyan Methodists, we sing our theology quicker than we read or talk our theology. That's kind of a warning too, to when you choose songs in your church worship services. However, these 166 hymns are formative for Methodists in their understanding of the Lord's Supper in particular. And they were used in worship. While you've got hundreds of people going to the Lord's Supper, you've got time. What do? You sing hymns about the Lord's Supper.
There you go.
So this is feeding into the Sunday service into America. These Methodists are desperate for the Lord's Supper and for babies are being baptized, right? Children are growing up and being nurtured in the faith. We need people to be baptized. So John Wesley approaches the Bishop of London. He says, no, your Methodists aren't educated enough. And so when he sends the third thing, these 3 people over to America to lead the Methodists in America, he sends with them a revised version of the Book of Common Prayer. Revised primarily because you can't give an English prayer book to now an American group of people.
Some of these are very explicit in their expressing their allegiance to the king. So
allegiance to the monarch, prayers for the monarch. You got to delete those kinds of things. And there's a few revisions that take place. And James White has done some really good work on this if you're interested in finding out what those changes were. The third thing, the major thing, the setting apart of Thomas Coke, Vassy, and Watcote, these 3 people. So in September of 1784, John Wesley says, I did this thing. I'll just use, paraphrase. I did this thing, but I didn't want to do this thing. And the reason I did this thing is my hand was forced. We have hundreds of thousands now of Methodists in America. They have no church that they can receive the full expression of church, which primarily is sacraments. They have no opportunity for that. I'm in a situation now where I need to do something for them. We are no longer one country, and this is a rule in the 39 Articles of the Church of England. You may not know this, but the Church of England has no authority over any church in any other country. There is something called the Anglican Communion, but there's no authority there. And you've kind of seen this recently, that there's some tension in the Anglican Communion because of a decision that the Church of England made, but actually the Church of England has no authority on the other. Each Anglican expression, I could say, has its own authority to make its own decisions. It cannot impose decisions on another nation. This is the situation that John Wesley's in. The American situation is unique.
Yeah.
There's no Anglican authority there anymore. So Wesley takes it upon himself to set apart, and that's the phrase that he uses in his public journal, in his diary. He does use the word ordain.
Okay.
So he set these people apart to lead the work in America. They appointed, and he called him superintendent. So when they arrive, Thomas Coke then has a worship service with Francis Asbury, who Wesley said to make a co-superintendent, and he called him a bishop. That was a big no-no. So John Wesley and the American Methodists, from that point onwards, began to separate.
Tension, yeah.
It was bad. I won't say on this podcast what Charles Wesley said about Francis Asbury. You can go read that for yourself. But it was language that we wouldn't sing in church, right? And it was not a good situation. However, why did Wesley do this? I think I've illustrated that a little bit. It was a sacramental reason. How did he do this? What justification did he have?
Right. This is key.
So in my PhD studies, often I would just walk the stacks. I encourage you guys who are students out there, just walk the stacks in your library. If you're using digital resources, hopefully there's a way that we can do that one day, that we can just kind of work the stacks. I came across this book early on in my studies, John Muncie Turner, Conflict and Reconciliation, Studies in Methodism and Ecumenism in England. This is just a collection of essays that addressed some moments of tension in the Wesleyan Methodist tradition over the last couple of 100 years. Just started reading it. And when I got to page 12 or 13, there was a phrase in here that made me think, oh my goodness, how have I never heard about this? How have Methodists never heard about this? It's on page 19. I'm going to read this to you. It says, the American church life had produced a remarkable world where the Episcopal dissenters had resisted Congregationalist church tax and where Episcopalians were scandalized by the thought of bishops. It was in 1782 that William White, rector or pastor of Church of Christ in Philadelphia, prepared a pamphlet called The Case of the Episcopal Churches in the United States Considered. White wrote from a clearly distinguishable latitudinarian position, and then he mentions John Locke, he mentions Benjamin Hoadley. But then he says, he says, it would be odd if John Wesley's keen antenna had not picked up some echoes of it, though I can find no evidence that he read the case, and indeed later, whether he met with White or not. That was it.
Yeah.
This opened all kinds of doors. Who is William White?
Yeah.
What is the case of the Episcopal Churches commonly considered? So I went through my databases that I had access to, and I found this document. I read it cover to cover 2, 3, 4 times in a row, marked it all up, and it just opened a whole new world for me in understanding from an Anglican ecclesiology perspective, the justification of Wesley that he made for doing what he did is rooted in Anglican theology. This was not a pragmatic solution to a problem. This was a solution embedded within the framework of Anglican ecclesiology, going all the way back to Richard Hooker that I mentioned.
Right. It's so fascinating. Yeah.
So John Wesley, if you've done any study, you've probably read about Edward Stillingfleet, you've read about Peter King, a couple of people that he read many, many years, decades actually, about 40 years before he made this decision. He had come to the conclusion that actually the New Testament doesn't give a blueprint for ecclesiology. And I mean, you talked about global Methodism, trying to decide what we're going to look like and how we're going to function. Well, can't you just go to the Bible?
That's right.
Didn't the Bible just tell you what to do?
Church is supposed to be structured and ordered, how terms are, what the Constitution is supposed to be. I mean, this is, I was actually a part of the general conference of the Global Methodist Church. And I think one of the insights I have even from this studying the 18th and 19th century Methodism is that one of the continual claims is that there isn't a set order within Scripture. Apostolic succession is really kind of almost a myth of its like true kind of connections to the primitive church. And this leads people like the groups I study, like the Salvation Army, to say, hey, we're going to come up with whatever we want. And we're going to say that's the biblical model. And so we're going to say, actually, what happened in the New Testament was a military, right? So you have like, this kind of ambiguity becomes the foundation for creating new ideas. And so you're saying, Wesley, Stinging Fleet, and Peter King picked up these ideas from them. But you're saying, like, while they're important in his understanding of what a deacon, a bishop is, it's really Hooker. He goes back to Hooker to be, and was William White was what directed him possibly to Hooker?
Yeah. So what I will say this one thing. I love the Bible.
Yes, amen. Yeah, we're both. Yeah.
But the Bible doesn't give a blueprint. Otherwise, there would just be one church.
Yeah, sure.
And it would be one ecclesiology. And actually, I think that's okay. I think having a triune God should give us an indication that diversity in the church body of Christ actually might be an image of who God actually is. That having different expressions of church is an expression of the diversity that God has created in the world. I'll say that.
Right, yeah.
Now, when we get to this William White document, so I read it. William White quotes Stillingfleet. He quotes Benjamin Hobley, who's another 17th century person, and he quotes Richard Hooker. The arguments, and Stillingfleet and King also draw their inspiration from this Richard Hooker writing as well. So that took me back. So I had come to that realization early on in my studies, but then it took me back to the Richard Hooker writing, and I came across in volume 8, right, guys? I had read thousands of pages, and I finally get to the last book, volume 8, and there's a phrase in there that says something like, sometimes the exigence of necessity requires us to divert from the normal means of the church, or the normal operations of the church. That phrase, the exigence of necessity. So, William White, he's a part of the diaspora, right? Now, or the ones who were left behind in the church.
Philadelphia leaders.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is a church that will become the Episcopal Church in America, but it's not yet formalized. So he wrote this document as a proposal, just like what you're doing right now. What should we look like? How should we organize ourselves? And he had 2 suggestions. One of those suggestions was, let's wait until things calm down, and then we can send some of us over to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we can have some people set apart as bishops in the normal way that we normally do, apostolic succession idea that you just mentioned. And then we will continue our ministry and our ecclesiological model as normal in America with a few different things. That was one option. The second option, which is the one that he preferred, he said, let's just make somebody a bishop now. We have some priests. There's enough of us ordained. In that system, you need 3 ordained people to then consecrate someone a bishop. He said, let's just do it. Let's make someone a bishop. Then we'll have a bishop, and then we can move forward in the normal way. This is almost like a little blip in the system. Richard Hooker talked about this way back when. Now, someone might ask, well, Richard Hooker said we didn't have this kind of a situation, but he gives us an example. And the main example was this. When Mary, so going back to Henry VIII, Mary, his eldest daughter, takes the throne, she switches the Church of England from Protestant to Catholic. Many people who were considering leadership ministry left. They're called the Marian exiles. They left and went to Geneva. This is kind of the foundations of a heavy Presbyterianism in the church later on. But they left and they went to Geneva for several years until Mary died. And when Elizabeth took the throne and said, actually, let's switch everything back to Protestant, they returned. In the meantime, they were ordained in the Presbyterian form in Geneva. Now, the Church of England is an Episcopalian form. Bishops, priests, deacons, and the bishops are the ones who are ordained. It is a hierarchical kind of a system. In the Presbyterian form, everyone is on the same kind of even keel. You might have someone called a moderator, who is like a leader among equals. But in terms of ordination, they are all the same. These people were ordained. They come back after Elizabeth takes the throne. They're not reordained. They're accepted. Why is that the case? Exigence of necessity. This is an unusual circumstance in the church. The exception does not make the rule. That's the key thing when it comes to John Wesley in 1784. The exception does not make the rule. So, Richard Hooker, there's foundational in him. Translated, Peter King, Stillingfleet, Benjamin Hoadley in the 17th century, makes its way to John Wesley and William White. The thing that was most remarkable for me in 1784 when I was doing my studies is that the William White justifications and arguments and the John Wesley justification arguments are literally the same. They draw from the same resources in their own tradition, their own denomination. They both reached out to the Bishop of London. William White did the same thing. William White got a nicer answer than John Wesley, but they both were said, no, we can't do this right now. They followed the rubric, right? They followed what they should have done in the Church of England. And so it was, Wesley would say he was kind of pushed to this decision. And ultimately, because of the results of what happened in Methodism, I don't know if you know this or not, but I teach this, the history of the Wesleyan holiness tradition. And when we make the transition from early Methodism, John and Charles Wesley, to the next versions, I get the students to understand very clearly there is no Methodist church.
Right.
Ever. There's never a Methodist church. There's Methodist churches after John Wesley dies. So as long as he is alive, he's adamant we are not a church. And when it comes to church, and this is my kind of framework for my thesis, according to Anglican ecclesiology, Methodism does not meet all of the criteria for church. It meets some, but not all of them. So until John Wesley dies, and they have a system in place that covers all of those characteristics, the pure word of God is preached, the sacraments are duly administered, the congregation of faithful people, all of those things, until that takes place, you don't have a Methodist church. And as soon as you have a Methodist church, actually you have multiple Methodist churches. Right. You have the old plan, you've got the new plan, you've got the new connection, you've got the Bible Christians, you've got the Wesleyan Methodists, you've got the new connection, you've got the primitive Methodists, you got the Salvation Army not long after this. So it's really important. These details matter when we're looking at John Wesley's ecclesiology.
Yes.
Now, this is not me saying anything about any of these other denominations. I'm simply talking about the circumstance that John Wesley found himself in. And so that's kind of a brief.
No, it's good. I mean, this is the spark that leads to all of these denominations and eventually your own denomination 120 years later. So like you have some time where this happens, but it ends up being thought of as this, as one author says, age of disunity, even though there is unity behind the ideas, like the kind of Methodist foundation. But a lot of them are trying to, by the time you get to the American Holiness Movement, trying to be most authentically Wesleyan. So the Wesleyan Church comes into existence because it's trying to revive true Wesleyanism in that period. And I think there's even a way that what we experience now is part of that as well. But it's so foreign to what would have happened with John Wesley before he would have died, because it was always this reform movement.
And I'll show this one little interesting nugget as well. Yeah. So I picked up this book here, Early Episcopal Church Documents, 1755. I mean, this is an eBay kind of a find, and I have to give credit to John Kulaga. He pointed this out to me many years ago. And in this book, we have some facsimiles. The William White papers. He ultimately, you do need to know this. The early leaders of the Episcopal Church, they said, "Okay, thanks, William White, but we're not going to go with your preferred option. We'll wait." And so several years later, William White and two others did go to London. They were consecrated bishop by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so the Episcopal Church can say we have a direct connection, through apostolic succession with the Church of England. Now, in this collection of papers, the William White papers, is a pamphlet, and in that pamphlet, and the title of that pamphlet is called "Reasons Against Separation from the Church of England," written by John Wesley.
There it is. Wow.
That means William White had a pamphlet written by John Wesley. This is about a couple of decades before the 1784 stuff, outlining 12 reasons why Methodism should not separate from the Church of England. And the sacramental issue was one of those. However, the most interesting thing about this is that in the marginal notes to that document, William White says, you can't read it because it's kind of hard to read, but I'll just point it out. This is William White's marginal notes. He says, when Charles Wesley passed this pamphlet in my hands, and then he goes on to say, what's happening in this argument is exactly applicable to what's happening in America right now.
Wow. Yeah.
Right? That means William White met Charles Wesley.
Wow. Interesting.
We don't have the trail ends there. Yeah. We don't know anything more than that, other than somewhere at some time. We do know that William White did go to London to have this consecration. Probably took place around that time. This is a few years after 1784. There's one letter exchange between John and William White. William White says to him, I'm going to be in London on such and such a date. I'd like to meet up and discuss what's happening in America. Here's where I'm going to be staying, get in touch, kind of a thing. Then there's a letter later from John Wesley to William White saying, I'm really sorry, I couldn't make that date. Who knows what would have happened, right? Mm-hmm. The reason that William White tried to meet with John Wesley is because Thomas Coke. Thomas Coke was an Anglican. He was a Church of England priest. He was the one sent by John Wesley to lead the Methodists in America. Thomas Coke went to be a co-superintendent with Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury was not about being a co-superintendent. He was about being a bishop. If you know anything about American Methodist,
but he was elected to that too. Yes. Nathan Hatch's point, there was a democratic element, even though he did function as an autocrat.
And so he took Methodism in America in a little bit different kind of a way. That's got its own history. But there's a letter from Thomas Coke to William White that says, this is in 1791, that says, we've got this many Methodists in America. You now have established the Episcopal Church in America. We are close brothers and sisters, cousins. Why don't we try to get together? Why don't we try to join together and become one church? Why are we separate? I suggest that if this is going to happen, we need to get John Wesley on board, because Francis Asbury, it sounds like Francis Asbury wouldn't be keen on this.
Yeah.
So please meet with John Wesley and talk about this. Then at the end of the letter, he says this: if you're not interested, or if you don't want this to take place, please burn this letter. Awesome. because I don't want Francis Asbury to know. You can kind of see the tension between Coke and Asbury. That's in John Vickers' Letters of Thomas Coke. You can look it up for yourself. It's a very fascinating story of what could have happened. So after this, William White, he's trying to, they tried to get together. But the dating of that letter, this is a second attempt, by the way. The dating of the letter, it was 1791 in May, I think. In March, John Wesley had died. But Thomas Coke didn't know that. Right?
Interesting, yeah.
So as a historian, you've got these big questions. What would have happened if the Methodists and the Episcopals were together from the beginning in America? Forget what happens now. Just put your history.
Yeah. Just in that period. Obviously, things have gone in very different directions.
Yeah. What could have happened?
I think that's important.
Then? Yeah. What could have happened even with, Church of England and Methodists in America and in the UK? I know they've been in talks for 20 years now. Could we join together? And one of the major issues, by the way, between them was ordination, John Wesley's ordinations. The Church of England said, some in the Church of England, not all, said that these were invalid. And so actually it invalidated 200 years worth of ordinations. So the Methodists are like, okay, we're not accepting those terms because you want to reordain those people. So it's kind of been ingrained now for 200 years. But if we keep ourselves back in 1784, all of these interesting ecclesiological questions are being raised. And I just found it a fascinating topic.
It is. Now, there's basically says hypothetically that they probably would not have, because Asbury had such control and momentum and growth that there's a way that Methodism American Methodism becomes something very different, with this emphasis on democracy, for that matter, and a also revivalism,
Yep.
and maybe in a more extreme version, and I don't say that in a bad sense, of getting to the masses, of Francis Asbury's desire to get to the uninhabited places.
Yeah.
There's a
I
way.
was going to say flexibility, adaptability,
sure.
right? Church of England or Episcopal, you need a church building, right? But Methodism, you don't. And actually, the Methodist Episcopal Church, as they were called in the 19th century, became the largest denomination by the end of that century because of their efforts in making these things happen. But interestingly, I'm teaching this stuff right now. There were several groups within the Methodist Episcopal Church.
Publican Methodist. Yeah.
Well, no, I was going to say
yeah.
the National Camp Meeting Association for the Promotion of Holiness.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Which were made up largely of Methodists, end up founding Church of the Nazarene, Wesley Methodist. I mean, we just do this over, and I'm a church historian. We do this over and over and over again. Interestingly, the church
people in the Salvation Army were Methodist. And you've had a chance to read my dissertation, but like it's surprising. Like it's a myth that the people who became a part of the Salvation Army were those just from the street. Certainly, there were people who were converted. But generally, what was happening is people from other traditions, particularly women who now had an opportunity to serve, found an opportunity to be a part of something that was new and vibrant, just like some people might go to a mega church today that's maybe winning new people and also claiming, by the way, we're not like a church. We're a little different. We're the Church of the Nazarene. We're not called the church. We're the Salvation Army. We're the whatever it is. Like we're trying to be different as a means of differentiating ourselves. That kind of all rooted back in some of these same ideas.
And I just have to say, God bless us, right? We're doing our best to follow what God has called us to do, to align ourselves with the witness of God in the Bible, to reach other people. I'm evangelical enough to say God calls us to reach people.
Yeah,
and we have these different ways of doing it. My concern as a church historian is that often if we struggle with our systems, we just create new systems.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
and that's not a bad thing necessarily, but these are real people we're talking about, real relationships we're talking about. And I'm doing some work right now on the Methodist and Wesleyan tradition in Australia. And because I teach this stuff, and the Methodists have been in Australia since the 1830s, but then you very quickly have a Wesleyan version. And my worry is often the witness this is to the world. I'm living in a world that's very different from your context.
Sure.
I'm living in a world where church is very low on the priority list of most people in this country. However, spirituality, interest in divine things beyond, is increasing. Mm-hmm. So you'll have a conversation with an average everyday Aussie about God and faith who would say, that's not what happens in church. Mm-hmm. Right? For a variety of reasons. And so, as a church historian, I'm constantly reading these things. I've got an image next to me on my desk of the vine and the branches. And you got Jesus in the center, and you've got the 12 disciples, and then the vines continue to go. And I really do rely upon that. This is my, kind of personal faith. I struggle with church often. I do. And I struggle with systems, and I struggle with politics. Just call it like it is.
For sure. Yeah.
However, I recognize in any of those moments that I'm one of those vines, one of those branches. What does John say in his letters? Abide in me. What does it mean to abide in Jesus? It means being part of that vine and recognizing that all of us have some kind of a connection to that vine. As much as we disagree about how our vine looks, there is a faithfulness that can be found in all of these different vines. And I try to keep my focus upon that. I'm principal of a college that's a part of a denomination, but we welcome people from all different denominations. And I know you do that in your seminary as well. And I think that's wonderful when we get people in the classroom who have these different traditions. In my history class right now, I have people from four different Wesleyan traditions who are all contributing to this class. It's really fascinating and iron sharpens iron kind of a thing. I love it.
Yeah.
So anyway, conversations like this, you're from a different tradition from me. We have a similar root, different denomination from me, but a similar tradition, a similar part on the
Yeah.
vine.
Sure.
And it's just wonderful, and I'm really interested to see how Global Methodism ends up, defining themselves in terms of their systems and their organizations. I'm keeping my eye on that.
Yeah. It's a really interesting period to try and think about that. And of course, one of the big decisions, we don't have time to cover it here. Last year at the General Conference, was there a good, healthy debate about the nature of bishops? What would it mean? Would we have bishops? Would we have just superintendents? Would they be geographic? Would they be roving? And so they ended up moving more toward the itinerant bishop system. So actually, a bishop could not be appointed to his or her own region. So they would be appointed other places, and they would not be, and I was happy with where this moved. They would not have administrative responsibilities. You talk about your struggle with, like, you didn't say this word, but institutions. Like, institutions are meant to serve a mission, but institutions end up crowding out the mission many times. And so my concern was that bishops, if they were given administrative responsibility as opposed to just theological and didactic responsibilities, could be problems. So thankfully, that was maybe the first debate. And it was, honestly, Joseph, I think one thing I say about it was a healthy debate. And both sides ended up, like, respecting each other, and the leaders from the side that were going more for an administrative bishop ended up really submitting and just being fine and saying, this is where God is taking us. Here we go. So we had a good sense of early conflict. And
I don't know if you've had this discussion yet, but I would be interested. You're calling yourselves Global Methodists, right? So I'm speaking on behalf of the non-American church. I would be very interested to see what the institution looks like from a global perspective. So I'm a part of the Church of the Nazarene, which is it is an international church. We do follow one, we call it a manual, that is supposed to be able to be used in 160 different world areas where we have our churches. I've lived in many of those world areas, and it's really difficult to do that. And I've seen some of the impacts of an American-centric global church.
Right. Yep.
Again, just speaking on my experience, some wonderful things, but also some not so wonderful things. So yeah, I'd be interested to find out. And I've spoken about this, but if global Methodism is going to be beyond the American borders, what does that relationship look like? Between the American church and the non-American church. That would be.
I'll give you a 30-second answer.
Go for it.
A minute. But essentially, there are committees are diverse in that sense, as diverse as they can be. I would say almost every day. That's a little exaggeration. Every month, a new conference is coming in, generally outside of the United States. And for what's worth, 2 of the 6 bishops that were elected, 2 were Africans from 2 different countries. And so there is that sense of what's happening, of this real intention, and hence intention of not being just an American. And when I say American, I mean United States, a states-focused church, even though that's where a lot of the activity happened. But part of the work that happened in the former United Methodist Church was the way that African churches were a part of this. And so there's more being added every day. So for instance, the conference I'm in, I'm not giving a 1-minute answer, but here it is. Mississippi, West Tennessee, we have partner conferences. Well, we're partnered with the Mega Manila Conference, which interestingly enough is in part the Philippines, but also all of the Middle East. And get this, you'll love this. Maybe you won't love it, but England, okay, Europe.
Wow.
And so there are a couple of GMC churches in England. So there is this attempt to do this, but it is hard. And coming from the context of the Salvation Army, which also is another way, is Wesleyan, global, top-down denominations. It is problematic.
Yeah, I mean, the only other model I can think of is the Roman Catholic.
Right. No. Yeah.
I mean, they are truly an international denomination that has a clear structure that is centralized, in Rome. And I love I love my denomination and its international flavor. And I have friends all over the world. And I say this all the time. If you're a Nazarene, you've got a place to stay, you've got a meal, you've got transport, in 160 places around the world. You're like brothers and sisters immediately. Salvos is probably similar to that. Um, but but my worry, especially let's go back to 1784. One of the reasons why John Wesley was able to do what he did is because there was no authority in the Church of England over the church in America. And that allowed the American version to be able to do what they needed to do for their own purposes, for their own context. And again, the support we have from other places around the world is just wonderful. But I'm concerned that our international folk have the voice and are at the tables and I do see that, and I see that increasingly. And I'm glad that you've highlighted that, for global Methodism. And like I said, I've got a keen eye.
Yeah, it's good. Well, and I really hope that my friends in the GMC and in these other Wesleyan traditions, get to review your work. Several of these pieces you can find in peer-reviewed articles. Hopefully your dissertation gets published here and stuff. Are you going to have it in a published form, your dissertation?
I had a sabbatical several years ago that kind of got sideswiped by a different project.
Okay.
But yes, it's still sitting there and it will be out at some point. But if anybody is interested, feel free to send me a message and I'm happy to share it with
really interesting stuff too, which we didn't get a cover on John Wesley's theology of baptism and the Lord's Supper. And actually on a podcast I just did with Beth Felker Jones, I mentioned your dissertation. She has a book that just come out, Why I'm a Protestant. And I mentioned like your emphasis, or it was through you that I learned this, that John Wesley didn't really even want to do extemporaneous praying. I think there's a lot of things in here that I think people could find useful. Yeah.
The other thing is 90% of his preaching was inside a building, not outdoors.
There you go.
The outdoor stuff is like cool and interesting and Billy Graham style, but actually that was not normal at all. Most of his preaching was done in churches of England or Methodist preaching houses.
Right. Interesting.
And one of the reasons why he preached outdoors is not because sometimes Church of England priests would say, no, you can't preach in my church. But oftentimes the people couldn't fit. So he preached outside. So again, there's lots of nuances. It's wonderful to have this beautiful image of this guy preaching on the hills, which he did too, but that was not the norm.
Yeah, interesting. Oh man, Joseph, so much to pick up on. Okay, so I always ask a question, and for theological reasons, in a sense, there's more to the story. There's more than just having our sins forgiven. There's sanctifying grace. But at the same time, I wonder, is there more to the story of Joseph Wood?
Absolutely. I'll tell you a couple of things in my life. So growing up as a kid, I was a dirt biker. I was a motocross racer.
Oh, racer.
Okay. Yeah. So from the years of about 12 until maybe 16, motocross was my life. Wow. And I'd travel around and I would do racing and it was just fantastic. Second thing I would say is, European football, soccer, has been my sport, for my life. I played that and organized teams from 8 until 18. And then when I moved to the UK, I live in Manchester. That has two of the best teams in the world.
Yeah.
So I got to spend some time at Manchester United. That was my team.
So that's your team, United?
That's my team. Yeah.
Okay.
That I followed for years. More recently, I'm outdoors. Outdoors. Now I do watch rugby. I watch the NRL, the rugby league here in this country.
Yeah.
And I watch the AFL, Aussie Rules football. It's really interesting. For those of you out there, if you like American football, you'll get rugby league, the NRL. That's pretty easy transition. Aussie Rules, it's its own kind of a world. Have a look sometime.
Okay.
Aussie Rules, just YouTube it. It's really interesting. But I love the outdoors. And living in Southern Queensland, there are, within 2 hours drive, I can be at the beach, like a Southern California kind of a beach. I can be in the rainforest within about an hour and a half drive. I can be in the desert going into the outback. Wow. So I enjoy camping, hiking, mountain biking, anything to get me outdoors. It's my, my reconnecting with God kind of a stuff that I like to do.
Sure. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, Joseph, thanks so much for your time and thanks for the work you're doing at NTC. but also your scholarly work. It's, benefited me, and I'm sure others, particularly at this phase, what's happening in the broad Wesleyan world. So thanks so much for your time today.
I appreciate you, Andy, and all the best for your seminary and the work you guys are doing there.